In this example, we're given the equations for a supply and a demand curve. So we're going to start by drawing those on our standard supply and demand graph. So the demand curve has a y-intercept of 20, so that's where we start here. That's our y-intercept, and a slope of -1. So here is our demand curve given by the equation demand price equals 20, that's our y-intercept, and minus QD, right? So again, the slope is -1. And our supply curve has an intercept, a y-intercept of 0, and a slope of +3. So supply is given by the equation supply price equals 3 times the quantity supplied. Right? And our equilibrium will be where supply equals demand, as always. So let's label that Q star and P star. And we can go ahead and solve for P star and Q star by setting supply equal to demand. So 3Q is the supply price, and the demand price is equal to 20 minus Q. So Q equals 5, right? So we can label 5 here on our graph. And then the equilibrium price is found by plugging the quantity of 5 back into either the supply or the demand curve. Here the supply curve is simpler, so I'm going to plug it in for the quantity supplied, and we get an equilibrium price of $15. So 15 is here, P star. All right, and the next part of this question asks us to calculate the consumer surplus generated in this market and the producer surplus. So recall that consumer surplus is going to be given by this triangle. In other words, it's the difference between the price that the consumers pay for their product and the maximum price they're willing to pay, which is given by their marginal value for the product. Right? And each of the 5 transactions here is going to generate some surplus. So that's why the surplus is this whole region. Right? And then similarly, the producer surplus is given by this triangle. Right? Again, it's the difference between the price that the sellers get for their product and the minimum price they're willing to accept, which is given by the supply curve, which represents their marginal cost of production. So anything that they receive above that minimum selling price is considered producer surplus. So let's start by calculating consumer surplus, right? Consumer surplus is calculated as the area of that top triangle, so 1/2 times the width of the triangle, which is 5, because there are 5 units bought and sold, times the height of the triangle, which is the difference between 20 and 15. So consumer surplus is half of 5 times 5, which is 12.5. And now let's calculate producer surplus, which is equal to the area of the lower triangle, so 1/2 times the width of the triangle, which is 5, times the height, and in this case, since the y-intercept of the supply curve is 0, it simplifies things a little bit for us, but that's not always the case. So that ends up being 37.5. Okay, so then the next part of the question says, suppose that a price ceiling of $9 is imposed on this market. So we want to draw that price ceiling, and then we want to figure out the impact of it on our market in terms of quantity and then producer and consumer surplus. So 9 is below our P star, so 9 is somewhere here. So the ceiling is $9. Right? And it's just going to cut the market here. So while the market wants to get to P star, with this binding price ceiling, the market can't get that high. It can be anywhere below the ceiling, but it can't go up here, which is where it wants to go. So it's going to just get stuck as close as it can. It's going to get stuck at a price of 9. So at a price of 9, we're going to have a distortion between supply and demand, right, as seen here. So at this lower price, sellers don't like that, so they're going to lower their quantity supplied, and buyers like lower prices, so they're actually going to increase their quantity demanded, right? And the difference between the supply and demand quantities is going to be the size of our shortage now of the product. Now, the actual number of transactions in this market will be determined by the quantity supplied, because while this many consumers want to buy the product, there's only this much of it to go around. So this will determine how many units are actually bought and sold. Okay, so what is that quantity supplied? Well, we can figure that out by plugging a price of 9 into our supply curve, and it'll spit out this quantity. And if we're interested, we can also plug this price of 9 into the demand curve, and it'll tell us the quantity demanded. And in that case, we could actually calculate how big of a gap we have. Okay, so let's just focus on this piece for now. So to calculate the quantity supplied, we're going to plug 9 into the supply curve. So let's do that up here, 9. And then we'll see what the quantity supplied is that's associated with that. So quantity supplied is 3 units when we have a price of 9. So there will be 3 transactions now rather than the original 5 that we had at Q star. All right, so the next part of the question asks us, or the rest of the question asks us to figure out the impact on consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus. So one thing to notice here is that, well, there's now fewer transactions, right? 3 transactions instead of 5. So that's going to reduce the opportunity for surplus to be created. So we're going to cut off our total surplus triangle here. And all of this is now going to be what we call deadweight loss, which is just a loss in the overall surplus or welfare created in the market. And some of it is a loss in consumer surplus. So this part right here is a drop in consumer surplus. And then this lower part of the triangle is a drop in producer surplus. Right? So both consumers and producers lose from the price ceiling because there's fewer transactions occurring, and so there's fewer opportunities to create that consumer and producer surplus. However, some of our consumers, the ones who still get to buy the product, right? So not these consumers that no longer get to buy the product, but these, they're actually better off, because before they were paying $15 for the product and now they're only paying $9. Right, so basically this rectangle here represents the gain to consumers. That's a gain in consumer surplus. So we can indicate that this rectangle here is a gain in consumer surplus. And in fact, it's a reallocation from the producers to the consumers. So this is a loss. That's a down arrow in case you can't read that. In producer surplus. So that's what this rectangle is representing. All right, so let me make that clearer perhaps by drawing the rectangle now. This is now the consumer surplus. The consumers lost some. They lost this piece over here, this little bit of the dead weight loss, but then they gain this rectangle. So whether consumers are overall better or worse off depends on whether this gain is greater than this loss. On the other hand, producers are definitely worse off because they lost this triangle, this part of the dead weight loss, because of the fewer transactions. And for the transactions that still happen, the producers now earn less money, so they're losing surplus there, right? So it's a lose-lose for the producers. All right, so let's go back to dead weight loss and calculate what that ends up being. So to figure out dead weight loss, we need to calculate the area of this yellow triangle, but first we need to know what this height is right here, right? So we need to know this number so that we have all the information we need to figure out the area of that dead weight loss triangle. So how do we do that? Well, if you take a look at the graph we've created, if we plug in a quantity of 3 into the demand curve, it'll spit out the price associated with a quantity of 3, right? So we need to do that first. All right, so over here with our demand curve, let's plug in a quantity of 3, and the demand price associated with the quantity of 3 is 17. So 17 is the number here. And now we can calculate our dead weight loss. So the dead weight loss is equal to 1/2 times the width of the this triangle. So it's the distance from 3 to 5, right? From 3 to 5. So it's a distance of 2. And then the height of the triangle is from 17 all the way down to 9. So that's 8. Right? So our dead weight loss is equal to exactly 8 units, or $8 worth. All right, so next we're going to look at specifically the consumers and the producers. So we've just shown that there's a dead weight loss of 8, meaning overall in this market, the price ceiling caused a welfare loss equal to $8. But then let's look more specifically at the consumers and the producers. So we know that the consumers both gained and lost, sort of depending on which consumer you are, right? So consumer surplus increased by this rectangle here. All right, so let's calculate that. So the increase in consumer surplus is equal to the area of that rectangle. So the width of the rectangle goes from 0 to 3, so that's 3. And the height goes from 15 to 9, so that's 6. So consumers gain 18, but then they also lose that little bit of the dead weight loss triangle, right? And we have everything we need to calculate the area of that triangle. So the area is equal to 1/2 times the width. The width is from 3 to 5, so 2. And then the height is between 17 and 15, so another 2. So 1/2 times 2 times 2 is 2. So they gain 18, they lose 2, so the consumer surplus overall gains by 16. So that lower price does more than compensate for the loss in transactions when we think of the consumers as an entire group, even though some of those consumers are not in fact better off. All right, so now the producer surplus. All right, we know that producer surplus falls by 2 dimensions. So first, let's calculate this rectangle, right? The producers lose this rectangle. It goes to the consumers, right? So we already calculated that over here. It's equal to 18, right? And then they also lose because of the lower number of transactions. So this little triangle here. So that triangle, the area is equal to 1/2 times the width. So the width again is from here to here, from 3 to 5, or 2. And then the height is between 15 and 9. So that's 6. So there's a loss of 6, a loss of 18. So overall, it's a loss of $24 worth of surplus.